What if the 10 plagues of Exodus weren't random disasters, but a calculated assault on Egypt's most sacred beliefs? In this video, we're uncovering the hidden strategy and mythology behind these ancient catastrophes. And by the end of this video, you'll see how each plague was a direct attack on Egyptian religion and gods. So let's dive right in. Now, the first plague is the Lord turning the Nile River into blood. And this is a big deal because the Nile was the source of all Egyptian life. Everything depended on the annual flooding of the Nile. This is known in scholarship as the inundation, where rich silt or soil would be deposited along the banks of the Nile for the growing of crops, which is important because you've got to eat to stay alive. And because of this, the Nile, and more specifically the annual flooding, was deified and personified and known by the name Hapi. And Egyptians as early as the pyramid text referred to the Nile by the name Hapi. And it was Hapi who was said to have kept Egypt alive. Therefore, when the Nile turns to blood, this is really problematic because it means that Hapi is not in control of the Nile River. He's not able to perform his job. And what's worse for an Egyptian is that this means that the God of the Israelites, whom Moses is representing, is actually the one who is in control of the Nile River. And it's not just undermining Hapi, because in Egyptian religion, Pharaoh is both the son of Re, or Ra, and the incarnate god Horus. And he was in charge of maintaining the order of Egypt, known as Ma'at, which was established at the first creation. So what this first plague does is it sets the stage for a public display of humiliation for both Pharaoh as well as the gods of Egypt. And this is done through a series of 10 plagues that describe a decreation narrative of Egyptian religion, theology, and worldview. However, Pharaoh does have a set of helpers. These are his magicians, which is really an unfortunate translation. They're better understood as his chief priests. And these chief priests are able to replicate this first plague of turning water into blood. And this is important because part of these chief priests' role was to assist Pharaoh in the maintaining of Ma'at, or order. While this is usually understood as a tie between the Lord and these magicians or these chief priests, because they matched what the God of the Israelites did, albeit on a much smaller scale, this is actually a major defeat. Because what they should have done was restore order by returning the Nile to its original state. But these priests end up adding to the problem and creating more blood. And this same thing happens in the second plague, when frogs begin to overrun Egypt. These chief priests are able to replicate the plague of frogs. But once again, this is a major problem because neither they or Pharaoh fix the problem of restoring Ma'at. They simply add to the problem. And again, it's not just Pharaoh or these priests who are falling short. It's the gods. And specifically, in this case, it's the goddess Heqet. She is a goddess who is depicted as having a female body with a frog's head. And she blew the breath of life into human beings after her spouse, Khnum, fashioned them on his potter's wheel. And she was also associated with and assisted as the midwife at birth, which this does link back to earlier in the Exodus narrative when it talks about the Hebrew midwives. But most importantly for this discussion, the goddess Heqet had the responsibility to control the multiplication of frogs in Egypt. And these frogs were a symbol of both divine power as well as fertility. And to an Egyptian, when the frogs are out of control and unregulated, it means that just like Hapi, Heqet is not performing her proper function. And moreover, it means that the God of the Israelites, who has sent these frogs through means of Moses and Aaron, actually has superiority over Heqet. She is not in control of the frog population in Egypt. It is the God of the Israelites who is. And it means that once again, the Lord is demonstrating his authority over the Egyptian deities. He is the one who is in control of the frog population, and he is the one who is in control of fertility, not Heqet. Now here's where we see a transition with the third plague. This is the plague of gnats, and these gnats are everywhere. There is only speculation that this is an attack on an Egyptian deity, and that would potentially be Khepre, who is symbolized by the flying beetle, also known as the scarab or the dung beetle. And Khepre was associated with this specific beetle, as well as with the morning or the rising sun. However, rather than this potentially being an attack on a specific deity within Egypt, what is more likely is that this is actually an attack on Egypt's religious system, and specifically the priest within Egypt. More on that here shortly. First, let's talk about how this plague begins. And just as with the first two plagues, this one begins with the Lord instructing Moses to tell Aaron to stretch out his staff, which is followed by Aaron doing so. And this initiates the plague. By the way, this literary feature is why I am doing the plagues in sets of 3 and saving number 10 for itself. So if you want me to do a video on the literary structure of the plagues, let me know in the comments below. All right, back to the third plague. Now, the Hebrew behind where we get the translation of gnat is the word kanim. And while this term is not clear in meaning, we do know that this is some type of flying insect. And these kanim, or gnats, are a major problem for the proper function of Egyptian religion. And that is because the Egyptian priests can no longer serve Egypt's gods in the temples, because these kanim, or gnats, make them ritually unclean. And this comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who noted that, quote, there, referring to Egypt's, priests shave the whole body every other day, so that no lice or anything else foul may infest them as they attend upon the gods. So in other words, none of the priestly duties in Egypt can be carried out, which means that the gods are essentially abandoned. And these priestly responsibilities and obligations were essential to maintaining ma'at, or order. And furthermore, this is where Pharaoh's chief priest's ability to replicate the plagues ends, which yet again is another double attack on Egypt's religious system. Because not only are these priests ritually unclean, they can no longer perform miracles, something they were supposed to be able to do according to Egyptian texts. And they are unable to restore ma'at. They even admit to Pharaoh, quote, this is the finger of God. And so what we have here in the third plague is gnats infesting the land, which make the priests of Egypt ritually unclean to serve in the temples, thus abandoning the gods of Egypt. Now, up is the plague of flies, but more specifically, this is the Hebrew word arov, which is commonly understood as a stinging fly or perhaps a mosquito. And these stinging flies swarm throughout Egypt. But during this plague, God distinguishes the Egyptians and the Israelites. This isn't just a nuisance, it's a sign that Yahweh favors his people. And this plague is closely linked to the third plague of gnats, because the flies, just like the gnats, create an environment of ritual impurity for the Egyptian priests, and specifically for Pharaoh's chief priests that we discussed in the last video on plagues 1 through 3. I'll link an article in the description if you're interested in the etymology and linguistic connections. But these chief priests are supposed to maintain ceremonial cleanliness to uphold ma'at, or the cosmic order, and they suddenly can't do their jobs because the priests can no longer serve their gods, offer sacrifices, or perform any other miracles necessary for the upkeep of Egyptian religion. And in case you missed the video on plagues 1 through 3, here's a quote from the Greek historian Herodotus regarding the Egyptian priests. He said, there, meaning Egypt's, priests shave the whole body every other day, so that no lice or anything else foul may infest them as they attend upon the gods. And as Egyptologists Dimitri and Christine Meeks noted in their work, Daily Life of the Egyptian Gods, one major ritual was the morning service in the temple, which Egyptians considered to be the home of the god. Priests prepared offerings for the gods and rendered service to the religious statue by washing it, anointing it with oil, and perfuming it. The god would be given a change of clothes. The priests then presented their offerings for the god's consumption. And so what this plague of flies does is render the entire Egyptian religious system inoperable. And Exodus 8:24 states that throughout all the land of Egypt, the land was ruined by swarms of flies. Therefore, what we have here is a direct attack on their religious system. And the message is clear. Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, his authority over creation is unmatched, and the Egyptian priests are powerless to maintain that order. And this pattern continues in the fifth plague, except this time, it's a direct attack on the Egyptian gods. God warns of a devastating plague on Egypt's livestock or domesticated animals, but declares that the livestock of the Hebrews will be untouched. And this is exactly what happens. The domesticated animals of the Egyptians died, while those of the Hebrews remained untouched. And this is important because these animals provided essential, daily provisions such as food, milk, clothing, transportation, etc. But this is more than economic sabotage. This hits a major aspect of Egyptian religion, specifically regarding the sacred bull cults throughout the land. Because by wiping out the livestock, the God of the Hebrews strikes at the heart of Egypt's agricultural and fertility beliefs. Because the ancient Egyptians worshipped and viewed the bull as a symbol of fertility, strength, and agriculture. And to put it lightly, in terms of fertility, The bull was symbolic of planting the seed, and there were several bull cults throughout Egypt, as bulls were understood to be the embodiments of the Egyptians' god Ta and Ra, or Re. But perhaps none of these bull cults were more important than that of Apis, who had no shortage of descriptions, which among these included a black bull with special white markings, as well as a man with a bull's head. Now in Memphis, Egypt, not Tennessee, a live Apis bull lived in luxury and was worshipped at the temple. And this Apis bull was viewed as the embodiment of Ta while alive and Osiris upon death. And this bull was so sacred that it was mummified upon its death. So when this plague of the death of the domesticated animals occurs, it's a powerful demonstration that once again, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has command over all fertility and sustenance, further undermining the authority of Egypt's gods. And furthermore, Pharaoh, who was viewed as Horus incarnate, can't restore Ma'at or order, something previously mentioned in the video on Plagues 1 through 3 that he, as well as his chief priests, were supposed to be able to do. And the Egyptians expected them to be able to do so. And speaking of the chief priests of Pharaoh, they are one of the targets in the 6th plague. And this is the plague of boils. And while this plague only gets 4 verses, nearly all members of Egyptian society and religion are affected by this plague. Moses throws handfuls of soot into the air in the presence of Pharaoh, causing painful boils to break out on the Egyptian people and their animals throughout Egypt, as well as Pharaoh's chief priests, who at this point are unable to, quote, stand before Moses. But this isn't just physical suffering. Boils on the chief priests is a major point of emphasis in this story, because the chief priests were able to replicate plagues 1 and 2, that was turning the Nile into blood, as well as the plague of frogs, and they tried but could not replicate the 3rd plague, and that was the plague of gnats, but now they cannot even stand before Moses, who is God's chosen messenger. And this is their last appearance throughout the plagues. It shows their utter defeat. They are powerless before the God of the Hebrews. They cannot assist Pharaoh in restoring Ma'at or order, which is a big deal because they were thought to possess knowledge that not even Pharaoh himself had. And so this 6th plague of boils eliminates the chief priests from the fight. But it may be more than just the Egyptian people and the beasts of the field and the chief priests as well as Pharaoh who are a target for this plague. It may yet again be another demonstration of Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, showing that his power extends over all the Egyptian gods. And in this plague of boils, the deity Sekhmet is possibly the target. She was a goddess whose dual nature included a warlike, bloodthirsty persona who is said to breathe fire upon Pharaoh's enemies, as well as a deity that also brought pestilence. However, she was also said to ward off pestilence. And the priests of Sekhmet were one of the oldest medical societies in antiquity. This included both doctors as well as veterinary surgeons. And Sekhmet was depicted as a female with the head of a lioness. And during this plague of boils, Sekhmet is unable to prevent the affliction of boils brought upon the Egyptians by the God of the Hebrews. Now, plague number 7 is the plague of hail. And the warning comes first. Moses stands before Pharaoh and announces a hailstorm unlike anything Egypt has ever seen. And this isn't just bad weather. It's a supernatural event, a direct challenge to the Egyptian understanding of nature and the gods who supposedly control it. So imagine this. Crops and livestock are battered and destroyed. The agricultural foundation of Egypt, the very thing that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world, is shattered. But this isn't just economic sabotage. In Egyptian religion, the goddess Nut was believed to arch over the earth, protecting the land beneath her. And due to the nature of her description, I'll refrain from providing a visual. But she is most often depicted as a star-covered nude woman who is arching over the earth. Her fingertips and toes are touching the 4 cardinal points, forming a protective canopy above the world. If you're familiar with ancient cosmology, even back from Genesis chapter 1, Nut can be seen as the dome or the vault of the sky. And then alongside Nut, there is the deity Tepnut, the goddess of moisture, who is depicted mainly as a woman with the head of a lioness, and less often simply as a woman. And then there was Shu, who was the husband and also the brother of Tepnut, and Shu was the god of the air or atmosphere, and he supported the heavens and held up the sky. Shu and Tepnut were also the parents of Nut. But aside from this family tree, what happens with this plague of hail is that with every crashing hailstone, the power of these Egyptian sky deities is publicly humiliated, and the message is clear. Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, reigns supreme over the elements. Exodus 9:31 even mentions that the crops of the food supply, so the flax or the barley, were destroyed. And for a brief moment, Pharaoh admits that he has sinned. He recognizes Yahweh's power, but his heart remains hardened after the Lord removes the hail. And moving on to plague number 8, the devastation doesn't stop. With the crops already ruined by the hail, God sends a swarm of locusts to finish the job. And so every plant that survived the hail was consumed by these locusts, which means that Egypt's food supply is essentially gone. Now, there is an inscription from the 25th dynasty in Egypt that speaks of a fine field in which the gods protected against grasshoppers. And so there are scholars that see a link between the locusts and these Egyptian deities that protect against the grasshoppers. But there's a deeper layer to this. And some translations will say that the locusts covered the face or the surface of the land. But there's something that's lost in translation here, because the Hebrew word is ayin, which means the eye. So literally, the locusts covered the eye of the land. And in the Egyptian mind, the eye of the sun was a metaphor for Re, or Ra, one of the major Egyptian deities. And what's Pharaoh's response to the eye of the sun being covered? He begs for relief. And he even admits his sin again against the Lord, but also this time against Moses. And that's because this is not just a political defeat, it's a spiritual one. The gods of Egypt remain silent, and Pharaoh's power is exposed and empty. Yet again, once the threat passes, he refuses to let the Israelites go. And this covering of the eye of the land transitions us into the 9th plague. And this is the plague of darkness, where the sun is completely blotted out through the entire land of Egypt. And darkness covers Egypt for 3 days. However, in the land of Goshen where the Hebrews live, there is no darkness. And to an ancient Egyptian, this is beyond terrifying. And this is because the ancient Egyptians regarded Amun-Re, who was the personification of the sun, as their chief deity. And they believed that his rising in the east symbolized new life and resurrection. However, when the sun sets, this represents something different. It was Amun-Re symbolizing death and the underworld. And so if we think from this perspective, to the ancient Egyptians, when they don't see the sun rising for 3 days, it means that their chief deity is unable to rise out of the underworld. And so this isn't just the absence of light, it's the unraveling of creation itself. It's a cosmic message that Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, he alone commands light and darkness, life and death, and the authority of the entire cosmic order, or Ma'at to the Egyptians, belongs to him. And at last, we have arrived at the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. And while much could be said regarding the destroyer and the connection to Yahweh within this plague, or the institution of Passover, why its establishment is placed between the threat of the 10th plague and its occurrence, and how it is relevant to Israel's deliverance from Egypt, we are going to continue on the theme and only speak on the mythological elements of this narrative. And that's because this plague is the final showdown, and it leaves Pharaoh and the entire Egyptian religious system in an overturned, decreated chaos. And here's what Exodus 11, 5-6 reads. This is the threat of the plague. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. And this is exactly what happens in chapter 12 when Pharaoh refuses, once again, to let the Israelites go. And again, a distinction is made between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And this is the Passover aspect of this plague. But finally, when this happens, Pharaoh breaks. He summons Moses and Aaron by night and has all the Israelites, along with their flocks and herds, leave Egypt, because this plague has completed the destruction of Egypt's religious system. And that's because, if you recall, Pharaoh was viewed as a god while he lived on earth, and specifically as the incarnation of Horus. He was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, or the cosmic order. And part of that cosmic order was the transference of pharaonic succession in an unending, orderly manner. But this isn't possible with the death of Pharaoh's firstborn, because this is the one who is supposed to inherit the throne as the new incarnate Horus upon the current Pharaoh's death. Moreover, it was the Egyptian gods who put this system in place. So it's not just establishing dominance over Pharaoh, it is Yahweh demonstrating his ultimate authority over all aspects of the Egyptian religious system and the Egyptian gods. They are powerless and defeated. In other words, the establishment and maintaining of cosmic order belong to Yahweh alone. And in a final act of desperation, Pharaoh's last words in the story, spoken to Moses and Aaron after commanding them to take everything and leave, are, "Bless me also." It is Pharaoh admitting defeat, but also begging for cosmic order to be restored by Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, once his request of his people to be freed from Egyptian captivity is fulfilled. And if you like this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. And check out one of these videos that YouTube thinks you're going to like. Thanks so much, everyone.